The alarm on Sarah's phone read 6:47 a.m. when she heard the door slam. It wasn't a normal door slam, the kind that happens when someone's in a rush or the wind catches it at an awkward angle. This was different. This was final. This was a door slam that echoed with the weight of 7 years of marriage crumbling into dust, and Sarah's stomach dropped instantly, even before her mind caught up with what her instincts already knew. Emma was still sleeping in the room next door. Sarah could hear her soft breathing through the baby monitor they'd never gotten around to removing, a relic from when Emma was 2 years old and needed constant surveillance. She was 7 now, old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, but too young to articulate what she was feeling. Sarah pulled the duvet up to her chin, as if the thin fabric could somehow protect her from the day that was about to unfold. David had packed a bag the night before. Sarah had watched him do it, standing in the doorway of their bedroom in their modest Portland home, a craftsman-style house they'd bought 5 years ago with such hope and optimism. She'd said nothing as he methodically folded his clothes, jeans, work shirts, the sweater she'd given him for Christmas 3 years ago. She'd said nothing because what could she say? They'd been having the same conversation for months, circling around the same arguments like vultures. His career in pharmaceutical sales was consuming him. Her nursing shifts were unpredictable. He felt neglected. She felt overwhelmed. Emma had become caught in the crossfire of their deteriorating relationship, absorbing the tension like a sponge absorbs water. Now, as Sarah listened to his car pull out of the driveway, the finality of it hit her like a physical blow. He was really leaving. This wasn't a threat or a dramatic gesture. After months of tension, late-night arguments behind closed doors, sleeping in separate bedrooms, and the careful choreography of two people trying not to explode in front of their daughter, David had finally had enough. Sarah got out of bed and walked to Emma's room. Her daughter was curled up under her lavender duvet, clutching the stuffed bunny that had belonged to David's sister years ago. Emma's dark hair was splayed across her pillow, and she looked so small, so vulnerable. Sarah felt tears begin to form behind her eyes. How was she going to tell her? How do you explain to a 7-year-old that their father doesn't want to live in the same house anymore? That nothing is broken in a way that can be fixed? That sometimes people who love each other can't stay together? Sarah didn't wake her. Instead, she backed out of the room and made her way downstairs to the kitchen, where she found a note on the counter in David's neat handwriting. "I'm staying at the Riverside Hotel for now. I'll call you about Emma this week. I think it's best if we discuss this calmly. I have a lawyer. You probably should too." The words, "I have a lawyer," hit harder than anything else. This wasn't a separation born of a moment of anger that could be smoothed over with time and conversation. This was premeditated. This was calculated. David had been planning his exit strategy while they were still sharing a bed, still pretending everything might be okay. That Tuesday became the day that everything changed. Sarah called in sick to the hospital where she worked as a cardiac nurse, a job she loved, a career that gave her purpose and identity beyond being David's wife. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold as she stared at her phone, trying to figure out her next move. Should she call David? Should she wait for him to call her? Should she tell Emma today or wait until she had more information? Emma woke up at 7:15 a.m. as she always did and came downstairs in her favorite pajamas, the ones with cartoon cats on them. She didn't notice immediately that something was wrong. Children had that beautiful, terrible gift of existing in the present moment, unaware of the tectonic plates shifting beneath their world. Emma asked for her usual breakfast, cereal with strawberries and a glass of orange juice. Sarah made it for her, trying to keep her voice steady and normal. "Where's Daddy?" Emma asked casually, swinging her legs as she sat at the kitchen table. The innocent question nearly broke Sarah in half. "Daddy had to go to work early today," Sarah lied, hatting herself for it. "He's going to stay somewhere else for a little while, sweetie, but that doesn't mean anything is wrong. Sometimes grown-ups need a little space to think about things." Emma processed this information with the same serious expression she got when she was trying to understand her multiplication tables. "Will he come back?" she asked. "Of course he will," Sarah said, though even as the words left her mouth, she didn't know if they were true. She didn't know what David wanted anymore. She didn't know if this was a pause or a period at the end of their marriage. That week was a blur of phone calls and legal consultations. Sarah sat across from a family law attorney named, who looked at her with professional sympathy as he explained the reality of her situation. David had the upper hand, he said. He had a career with stable income. She worked irregular nursing shifts. David would likely pursue joint custody, possibly even primary custody if he could demonstrate that his schedule was more stable. The idea that she might lose Emma, that her daughter might spend most of her time with David, triggered a panic response so severe that Sarah felt her chest tightening. "What can I do?" she asked desperately. "How do I prove I'm a good mother?" Pushed his glasses up on his nose. "Right now, you document everything. You keep a record of every moment you spend with Emma. You show up for every single thing, her school events, her doctor's appointments, her extracurriculars. You become the most present parent in her life. You show the court that she needs you." Over the following months, Sarah transformed her life around this mission. She picked Emma up from school every single day, even when it meant dropping a shift at the hospital. She attended every school event, every parent-teacher conference. She documented everything with photographs and journal entries, but she also watched her daughter change in ways that broke her heart. Emma became anxious. She developed difficulty sleeping. She stopped raising her hand in class to participate. She became clingy, following Sarah from room to room in their house as if afraid her mother might disappear too. The anxiety manifested in odd ways. Emma would refuse to eat certain foods, would wash her hands until they were raw, would have nightmares that left her gasping in the darkness. Sarah took her to their family doctor, who referred them to a child psychologist, Dr. Santos. That's when the diagnosis came: selective mutism, a condition where anxiety literally stole Emma's voice in certain situations. It was rare, Dr. Santos explained, usually appearing in children who had experienced significant stress or trauma. The solution involved therapy, medication, and in some cases, other interventions. Now, 7 months later, Sarah stood outside the Portland courthouse on a November morning, holding Emma's hand as they approached the heavy wooden doors. Her lawyer had called that morning with updates on David's case. He was claiming that Sarah's mental health was unstable, that her work schedule was chaotic, that Emma needed the structure and consistency of living with him. The battle lines had been drawn, and today would be the final testimony before Judge made her decision. Sarah squeezed Emma's small hand, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Somewhere in that courthouse, in a decision that would be made by a judge who didn't know them, didn't understand their bond, didn't comprehend the love that existed between a mother and her daughter, their entire future was about to be determined. Emma looked up at her mother with eyes that held too much understanding for a 7-year-old. "Mom, am I going to stay with you?" she asked quietly. Sarah knelt down, meeting her daughter's eyes. "I'm going to fight for you with everything I have," she whispered. "I promise you that, baby. No matter what happens, you are loved, and I am never giving up on you." What Sarah didn't know was that there was a golden retriever named Max sitting in a hallway not far away, and that dog was about to change the trajectory of their entire lives in ways nobody could have anticipated. Dr. Santos had been a child psychologist for 16 years, and she'd seen every manifestation of anxiety that young children could present. But Emma was different. When Sarah first brought her daughter into the small office in downtown Portland, Emma was a shell of a child, withdrawn, silent, and trembling with an anxiety that seemed to have taken up residence in her tiny body like an unwelcome tenant. "She stopped speaking at school 3 weeks ago," Sarah explained during their initial consultation, while Emma sat in the corner of the room refusing to make eye contact. "She'll talk at home, but only to me. When her father comes to pick her up, she goes completely silent. And at school," Sarah's voice cracked, Her teacher says she hasn't raised her hand to answer a single question in a month. She just sits at her desk and stares. Had heard variations of this story before, but the severity of Emma's withdrawal was notable. She watched the little girl carefully, seeing the physical signs of anxiety. The way Emma's shoulders hunched up toward her ears, the constant fidgeting with her hands, the rapid blinking. Had learned over the years to read these micro-expressions, these physical tells that revealed what children couldn't or wouldn't articulate. "Emma, honey," said gently, moving slowly so as not to startle her, "can you tell me about your best day last week?" Silence. Emma's hands curled into fists in her lap. "That's okay. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but I want you to know that this is a safe place. Nothing you say here will be shared with anyone except your mom, and we're not here to judge you. We're just here to help you feel better." Over the next 6 weeks, and Emma worked together. The initial diagnosis came quickly: selective mutism, an anxiety disorder where children can speak in some contexts but are literally unable to speak in others due to extreme anxiety. It wasn't a choice. Emma couldn't simply decide to talk in class any more than someone could decide to stop their heart from racing during a panic attack. Her brain had wired itself to shut down her voice in situations where she felt unsafe or exposed. Tried cognitive behavioral therapy, the traditional first-line treatment. She taught Emma breathing exercises, helped her identify her anxiety triggers, used exposure therapy to gradually help her become more comfortable speaking in different environments. Some progress came slowly. Emma could write answers on cards at school instead of speaking, which took some pressure off. She began to participate more, though her voice remained absent. But traditional therapy had limitations. Emma's anxiety was too deeply embedded, her nervous system too. That's when had an idea, one born from recent neuroscience research she'd been reading about service animals and their effect on pediatric anxiety disorders. "I think Emma might benefit from a service dog," told Sarah during a consultation without Emma present. "It's not a cure, and it's not a replacement for therapy, but there's solid evidence showing that specially trained service animals can help children with anxiety disorders by providing grounding techniques and emotional support." Sarah's initial reaction was skepticism. "A dog? How would that help? Won't that just be another thing to worry about?" "Not if the dog is properly trained," explained, pulling up research articles on her computer. Service dogs for anxiety work through several mechanisms. They can sense when a person's heart rate is elevated or their cortisol levels are rising, often before the person is even aware of their own anxiety. They can perform deep pressure therapy, applying their weight to calm the nervous system. They can create physical barriers in public spaces to make someone feel safer. And crucially, they create what's called a tether between the anxious person and a source of safety and comfort. Sarah listened, wanting to believe but afraid to hope. "How much does something like that cost?" "Between $20,000 and $30,000 for a properly trained service dog," said. "But I know an organization, Pacific Northwest Service Animals, that does pro work for children with documented anxiety disorders. They might take Emma's case." 3 months later, Emma met Max for the first time. Max was a 3-year-old golden retriever, 6 months into his specialized training for pediatric anxiety support. He was massive, 85 pounds of pure golden fur and gentle temperament. When the trainer, a woman named Karen who had been working with service dogs for over a decade, brought Max into the therapy room, Emma immediately recoiled. "It's okay," Karen said softly. "Max is here to help you, but we're going to go at your pace. You don't have to touch him or talk to him today. Just let him be in the room with you." For the first session, Emma and Max simply existed in the same space. Karen sat with Emma while Max lay on his dog bed across the room. By the third session, Emma reached out her hand, and Max gently licked her fingers. By the fifth session, Emma's head was on Max's back while she took a nap, something she hadn't been able to do in months without nightmares waking her. The bonding process took 6 weeks. Corinne taught Emma specific signals, hand gestures, and pressure points on the dog that would trigger Max's trained responses. A circular motion with her hand meant, "Help me calm down," and Max would immediately move to her side and apply pressure with his body. A tap on her leg meant, "I need grounding," and Max would rest his head on her lap, anchoring her to the present moment. A specific whistle sound meant, "I'm overwhelmed," and Max would create a physical barrier between Emma and the outside world, his body literally shielding her from the environment. Sarah watched her daughter transform. For the first time since David had left, Emma smiled genuinely. She began to sleep through the night. She started volunteering answers in class, quietly at first, but audibly. Her teacher reported that she was participating more, that the constant anxiety seemed to have lifted like fog clearing after rain. "This is remarkable," told Sarah. "I've never seen a child respond this quickly. Her anxiety scores have dropped by 60% in just 2 months. Her school attendance is improving. She's beginning to build resilience." But then David's legal team found out about Max, and that's when everything became complicated. David's attorney was a sharp woman in her mid-50s who viewed the world through the lens of legal precedent and advantage. When she learned that Emma had a service dog, she saw not a therapeutic tool, but a liability for Sarah's case. "This is perfect," she told David during a strategy session. "We can argue that your ex-wife is enabling avoidance behaviors. Instead of forcing Emma to confront her anxiety, she's given her a crutch. The dog is preventing Emma from developing true coping mechanisms and emotional resilience. This suggests that your ex-wife is prioritizing her own need to feel like a good parent over Emma's actual psychological development." David wasn't entirely convinced. He loved his daughter, and the improvement he'd seen in her during his visitation weekends was undeniable. Emma was happier, more talkative, more like herself. "This is standard custody strategy," explained. "We don't have to say the dog is bad. We just present an alternative narrative. Caring mother with good intentions who has chosen an unconventional path versus stable father offering structure and traditional psychological support. We suggest that the mother is relying on an animal instead of parenting through the anxiety. We question whether the dog is sustainable long-term. We present professional skeptics. There are always experts willing to testify that service animals are overblown." But what didn't understand, what nobody in David's legal camp seemed to grasp, was the profound neurobiological shift that had occurred in Emma's brain. This wasn't about avoidance. This was about creating safety, about teaching a nervous system how to return to baseline. Max wasn't a crutch. Max was a bridge, helping Emma cross from a state of constant terror to a state where healing could actually occur. Sarah knew this instinctively, even if she couldn't articulate the neuroscience. She watched her daughter blossom with Max by her side. She watched Emma go from a child who couldn't speak to a child who was slowly, carefully, finding her voice again. The dog had given Emma something that medication and therapy alone couldn't provide, the fundamental feeling of safety. As Sarah sat in the courthouse hallway the morning of the trial, Max resting his head on her lap, she understood that this dog represented everything she was fighting for. Not just custody, but the right to choose the therapeutic path that actually worked for her daughter. Not tradition, but efficacy. Not what looked good on paper, but what healed a broken child. Neither Sarah nor Max knew that what was about to happen in that courtroom would forever change how the legal system viewed service animals and emotional support. Neither of them knew that Emma's quiet signal to her dog would become a moment of such profound testimony that judges across the country would reference it for years to come. But as Sarah felt Max's warm weight against her leg, as she watched her daughter sit quietly with her hand resting on the dog's back, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. And she held on to it with everything she had. Judge had been presiding over family law cases for 32 years, and in that time, she developed a particular philosophy about custody disputes. Emotions cloud judgment. She believed that parents, no matter how well-intentioned, would lie and manipulate to keep their children. She'd seen it countless times, mothers claiming abuse that never happened, fathers manufacturing evidence of instability, grandparents ready to testify to anything if it meant access to the courtroom, she believed, was no place for feelings. It was a place for facts, evidence, and the application of law. Judge was 64 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She wore her judge's robes like armor, and her face had the kind of permanent expression that suggested she'd seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. She was respected in Portland legal circles. Her rulings were rarely overturned on appeal. Her logic was ironclad, and she had zero tolerance for what she called emotional theatrics in her courtroom. This morning, as she reviewed the custody case file before taking the bench, she'd already formed preliminary opinions. The mother worked irregular nursing hours. The father had a stable pharmaceutical sales job with predictable hours. The dog, that was the judge had done a quick Google search on service animals after her clerk had mentioned it, and she'd found plenty of articles about how service animal claims were being exploited by people who just wanted pets. She'd made a mental note. This needed careful examination. She wasn't going to let emotional appeals about dogs derail a legitimate custody determination. The courtroom filled slowly that morning. Sarah sat on one side with her attorney, who'd prepared her extensively but whose confidence seemed to waver with each passing minute. David sat on the opposite side who had the predatory air of someone who knew she had the advantage. Judge entered and took her seat, and the bailiff called the case. The morning had proceeded with David's testimony. He'd presented himself well, calm, articulate, concerned. He talked about his devotion to Emma, his concern about Sarah's mental health stability, his commitment to providing structure. Had guided him through his testimony like a conductor leading an orchestra, each question designed to paint a picture of a loving father and an overwhelmed mother. Now it was time for Emma to testify. "Call Emma," the bailiff announced. Sarah's hand found his arm, squeezing it so hard her fingernails left marks. In the back of the courtroom, Max began to rise, but the bailiff gestured for him to stay in his designated area. Service animals weren't permitted at the witness stand. Emma would have to testify alone. The little girl walked to the stand in her pink dress, the one Sarah had bought her specifically for this day. Her shoes, new white Velcro sneakers, barely made a sound against the courtroom floor. The bailiff held the Bible down low for her to place her hand on it. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked. "I do," Emma whispered, barely audible. Judge leaned forward slightly, observing the child with clinical precision. Emma's hands were trembling. Her eyes were fixed on her mother, then darted away. The judge made a note, nervous, possibly coached, possibly unstable like the mother. "Emma," Judge began, her voice formal and cold, "I need you to tell this court about your daily routine. What does a typical day look like when you're with your mother?" Emma opened her mouth. Her lips moved, but nothing came out. Her chest began to rise and fall more rapidly. She looked like she was trying to speak, but her voice had simply vanished, locked away behind a wall of anxiety that she couldn't breach no matter how hard she tried. "Go ahead, Emma," the judge prompted, her tone suggesting that she expected the child to simply push through whatever hesitation she was experiencing. "Just tell me what happens in the morning when you wake up." Emma's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. Her knuckles turned white. A tear began to form at the corner of her eye. Sarah half rose from her seat but pulled her back down. "She needs to try," he whispered urgently. "If you interrupt, it looks worse." Stood up, her movement sharp and purposeful. "Your Honor, I have some questions for the minor." Judge nodded. "You may proceed." Approached the stand, and even from a distance, Emma seemed to shrink further into herself. The attorney was tall, intimidating, and had a voice that could cut through marble. Emma said, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone used to getting answers. Your mother brought a dog to live with you, correct? Emma's eyes filled with tears. She nodded mutely. Is that yes? Why yes, Emma managed, her voice barely a whisper. Why did your mother get the dog, Emma? Emma tried to speak. The words formed in her mind to help me, or because I'm sad, or because Dad left, but her throat closed. Nothing came out. Did your mother tell you that the dog would help you be braver? Again, that terrible silence. Emma's hands began to shake visibly. Emma, I need you to answer me. Did your mother say the dog would make you braver? Sarah felt's hand on her arm like a vice, keeping her rooted to her seat. Across the courtroom, she saw David watching with what looked like pity. Or was it satisfaction? His attorney had orchestrated this. She'd specifically chosen to cross-examine Emma because knew about the selective mutism. She knew Emma wouldn't be able to speak. She was using the child's disability as evidence against Sarah. Your Honor stood. The minor has selective mutism and anxiety disorder, continued aggressive questioning. I'm not being aggressive, interrupted. I'm simply asking the child to answer questions. If the minor is unable to communicate, that's actually quite relevant to this custody determination, wouldn't you say? It suggests that the therapeutic interventions haven't been effective. Judge tapped her pen against her desk. Overruled. The witness will answer the questions. Emma was crying now, silently, tears streaming down her face. She looked like she might be having a panic attack. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid. She looked desperately toward where Max was sitting in the back of the courtroom, but the distance was too great. The dog couldn't help her from there. Emma pressed on. Isn't it true that your mother has you on multiple anxiety medications? Emma's head bobbed, a nod barely perceptible. And you miss school sometimes because of nervousness, don't you? Another nod. So even with the dog and the medications, you're still anxious, aren't you? Emma couldn't speak. She couldn't defend herself. She couldn't explain that the dog had actually helped, that she was better than before, that she loved her mother. The words were trapped inside her, inaccessible, locked away behind a wall of fear that no amount of willpower could breach. Judge was writing something, her expression grave. Sarah could read her body language, and it was devastating. The judge saw a child unable to communicate, unable to function under basic questioning. The judge saw evidence of a mother's failed interventions. The judge was being shown exactly what wanted her to see, a child in crisis. Your Honor, concluded, I believe this demonstrates that despite the service dog and despite medication, the minor is not stable enough to provide reliable testimony. In fact, her inability to communicate suggests that her mother's chosen interventions have been ineffective, and that perhaps a more structured environment with her father would be beneficial. Judge nodded slowly. The court agrees that the minor appears unable to provide coherent testimony. We will proceed without further questioning of the witness. But Your Honor stood, but the judge raised her hand. I've made my decision. Emma, you may step down. As Emma climbed down from the witness stand, she looked completely devastated. She'd failed. She hadn't been able to defend her mother. She hadn't been able to say anything. And in her 7-year-old mind, that failure felt catastrophic. She walked back to where Max was sitting, and the dog immediately stood, placing his head against her leg. But even Max's comfort couldn't penetrate the fog of shame and anxiety that had descended on her. Sarah was pale, her hands trembling as badly as Emma's had been. Was already flipping through his notes, trying to figure out his next move, trying to salvage a case that had just been severely damaged. Judge made another note in her file, and that notation would carry enormous weight. A child unable to testify, a mother whose interventions had failed, a situation requiring a firmer hand, a more stable environment. David and exchanged a look that suggested they both knew what was about to happen. They'd successfully portrayed Emma not as a child being helped by her service dog, but as a child broken by her mother's unconventional choices. What nobody in that courtroom understood was that they were about to witness something that would completely overturn their carefully constructed narrative. Emma was about to teach a judge about the true nature of healing, connection, and the profound difference between what looks good on paper and what actually saves a child's life. But first, she would have to reach the absolute breaking point. The recess that followed Emma's testimony lasted 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to Sarah. She found her daughter in the bathroom on the second floor of the courthouse, sitting on the cold tile floor beside the sink, completely withdrawn. Max was with them. The bailiff had allowed the service dog to follow Emma, recognizing that the child was in acute distress. Emma wasn't crying anymore. She'd moved beyond tears into a state of complete shutdown. Her eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance, unseeing. She was barely breathing. Sarah knelt down beside her daughter, and when she tried to wrap her arms around her, Emma felt rigid, almost wooden. "Baby, you did everything right," Sarah whispered, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "You tried your best. That's all anyone can ask." Emma turned her head slowly and looked at her mother with eyes that held a devastating clarity. "I couldn't do it, Mommy," she said, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't tell them. I failed you." The weight of that statement, the burden of responsibility a 7-year-old had placed on herself, nearly broke Sarah in half. She pulled Emma close, and this time her daughter let herself be held. Max rested his head on Emma's lap, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm. Found them there a few minutes later. His expression was grim. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "The judge has made some preliminary rulings and they're not good." They gathered in a small consultation room off the main hallway, closed the door and sat down heavily. "Is arguing that Emma's inability to testify demonstrates a fundamental problem with Sarah's parenting and her therapeutic choices," explained. "She's claiming that Emma is so anxious, so unstable that she can't even function in basic situations. And the judge, she's sympathetic to that argument. I could see it in her face. She sees a child who's broken, and she's blaming the mother's unconventional choices for that brokenness." Sarah felt the room spinning. "But Emma is better now. Before the dog, she didn't go to school at all. She wouldn't eat. She had nightmares every single night. She's made so much progress." "I believe you," interrupted, "and I'll present that evidence. But the judge doesn't seem open to it. She appears to view the service dog as a band-aid, not a real solution. And Emma's inability to testify is being used as evidence that the band-aid isn't even working." Sarah looked at Emma, who was still withdrawn, still in that place of complete self-blame. Max was pressed against her leg, his warmth the only thing seeming to reach through her fog of despair. "What happens next?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "David's team will present their closing arguments this afternoon. They'll argue for primary custody based on his stability, his income, and his ability to provide a structured environment. Then your team gets a chance to respond. Then judge takes the case under advisement. She could rule today or take a few weeks to decide." Looked directly at Sarah. "I'm not going to lie to you. Right now, based on what I saw in that courtroom, I think we're losing. The judge seemed to make up her mind when Emma couldn't testify. We need something, some piece of evidence or testimony that changes the narrative. Otherwise, I think you're looking at David getting primary custody." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She looked at her daughter, who was now huddled against Max, and she felt something inside her break. The fear she'd been managing, the anxiety she'd been suppressing, the terror of losing her daughter, it all came rushing forward in a wave so intense she thought she might collapse. Emma noticed her mother's distress and reached for her hand. Even in her own devastation, even in her own shame and fear, Emma was trying to comfort her mother. The role reversal was heartbreaking. "It's going to be okay, Mommy," Emma whispered. "Whatever happens, I love you so much, and I'm sorry I couldn't talk. I tried, I really tried." Sarah pulled her daughter close and let herself cry. She cried for the failure of her marriage, for her child's suffering, for the injustice of a legal system that seemed determined to separate them, for the exhaustion of fighting when everything seemed stacked against her. The afternoon session began at 2:00 p.m. The courtroom had filled with court personnel, with reporters who'd picked up on the story service dog at center of custody battle, and with various observers. The media attention made Sarah even more nervous. Every decision, every moment would be scrutinized. Delivered her closing argument with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't attack Sarah viciously or make her sound like an unfit mother. That wasn't her strategy. Instead, she painted a picture of a well-meaning but overwhelmed mother making increasingly unconventional choices. The dog, the therapy, the medications, all in an attempt to manage a child's anxiety rather than addressing the root causes. "Emma is clearly anxious," said, packing in front of the judge. "The medications haven't resolved her anxiety. The therapy hasn't resolved her anxiety. And now we're expected to believe that a dog will resolve her anxiety. Your Honor, this child needs stability. She needs structure. She needs a parent who can provide those things without relying on unconventional interventions. David can offer Emma that. He has a stable career, a predictable schedule, and a commitment to traditional therapeutic approaches. Emma needs her father, now more than ever." It was masterfully done. Had taken Sarah's greatest strength, her willingness to try anything to help her daughter, and transformed it into a liability. She'd made Sarah sound desperate, experimental, unstable. Stood for the rebuttal, but even he seemed deflated. He argued about Sarah's devotion, about her sacrifice of shifts at the hospital to be present for Emma. He talked about Emma's improvements in school attendance and her teachers' reports of increased participation. He presented Dr. Santos's research on service animals, but his words seemed to bounce off Judge's armor of skepticism without penetrating. The judge sat on the bench, her expression unreadable, making notes with a mechanical precision that suggested she'd already made her decision and was simply going through the motions of the process. At 3:47 p.m., Judge announced that she was taking the case under advisement. She would issue her ruling on Friday, 2 days away. 2 days for Sarah to wait and wonder if she was about to lose her daughter. 2 days for Emma to carry the weight of her perceived failure. 2 days of absolute uncertainty. As they left the courtroom, Sarah felt completely hollowed out. She'd done everything right. She'd fought, she'd sacrificed, she'd sought the best help available. And none of it seemed to matter against the weight of a judge's skepticism and a lawyer's manipulation. Emma walked beside her, holding Max's leash with one hand and Sarah's hand with the other. The little girl was being brave, but Sarah could feel the tremor in her daughter's grip. Emma was terrified. Emma was carrying the burden of this decision as if it were somehow her responsibility to fix things. That night Emma slept fitfully, her nightmares returning for the first time in months. She woke up screaming, and Sarah held her through the dark hours, both of them too frightened to sleep. Max never left Emma's side. The dog remained pressed against the little girl throughout the night, providing what comfort he could, though even his trained interventions couldn't penetrate the despair that had settled over them. Sarah looked at the calendar on her bedside table. Friday was just 2 days away, 2 days until a judge would decide her fate, 2 days until everything would change. What neither Sarah nor Emma knew was that those 2 days would contain a moment, a single, perfect moment, that would transform the entire trajectory of their lives. A moment when Emma would find her courage, when she would communicate in a way that transcended words, when she would speak a truth so profound that even a skeptical judge would have to listen. But first, they would have to endure 2 of the longest days of their lives. Max rested his head on Emma's sleeping form, his trained senses alert for any sign that the little girl needed him. In the quiet darkness, The service dog stood guard, faithful and true, waiting for the moment when his training and his love would be called upon in a way that would change everything. The breaking point had been reached, but what comes after a breaking point, if there is enough love and faith, is sometimes something beautiful. Friday morning arrived like a guillotine blade descending. Sarah woke at 4:47 a.m. without an alarm, her body anticipating what was about to happen. She lay in the darkness of her bedroom, listening to Emma's steady breathing from the baby monitor still perched on her nightstand. Her daughter had finally fallen into a deep sleep around midnight, exhausted from 2 days of anxiety and fear. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from "Judge will issue ruling at 9:30 a.m. Be there by 9:00. Bring Emma." The drive to the courthouse felt surreal, like moving through water. Emma sat in her car seat, wearing the same pink dress she'd worn on Tuesday. Sarah hadn't had the heart to take it off her, to suggest they dress for a different outcome. Max was in the back seat, his head out the window, his ears flapping in the wind. He seemed to sense the magnitude of the day. The courthouse hallway was already crowded when they arrived. Reporters clustered near the entrance, and Sarah had to navigate through them with Emma tucked against her side and Max pressed close. The media had become increasingly interested in the story as it unfolded. Service dog at center of Portland custody case had been the headline in the Oregonian that morning. Inside the courtroom, everything was arranged exactly as it had been on Tuesday. The only difference was the weight of finality hanging over everything. This was the day the judge would announce her decision. This was the day Sarah's and Emma's lives would be irrevocably altered. Judge entered at 9:32 a.m. and the entire courtroom fell silent. She took her seat and adjusted her reading glasses. She had a folder in front of her, her written ruling. She looked neither at Sarah nor at David, her gaze deliberately neutral. "In the matter of V," Judge began, her voice formal and clinical, "I have reviewed all testimony, evidence, and expert opinions presented during these proceedings. This is a difficult case involving 2 loving parents and a child caught in the middle. However, the court must consider the best interests of the minor, not the interests of either parent." Sarah felt take her hand. Emma was rigid beside her, her small fingers gripping Sarah's jacket. The evidence presented demonstrates that Emma suffers from selective mutism, an anxiety disorder of significant severity. During her testimony on Tuesday, she was unable to communicate despite being directly questioned by both counsel. This inability to function under basic circumstances is concerning. The judge paused, turning a page in her file. "However, before I issue my final ruling, I would like to recall Emma to the stand for one final question. I believe there is something I missed during her previous testimony, and I want to give her an opportunity to be heard." Everyone in the courtroom exchanged confused glances. This was highly irregular. Judges didn't typically recall witnesses after testimony had concluded. Leaned over to Sarah and whispered, "I have no idea what she's doing, but this could be good or bad." "Emma," the bailiff called out. Emma's face went pale. Sarah squeezed her hand. "You can do this, baby," she whispered. "Just listen to what the judge asks." Emma walked to the stand again, moving like someone walking through a dream. She was placed under oath again, though technically she was already sworn from Tuesday's testimony. Judge set down her reading glasses and looked directly at the child. "Emma," the judge said, and her voice was different this time, softer somehow, less clinical. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there's no right or wrong answer. I want you to answer from your heart, not because anyone told you what to say. Can you do that?" Emma nodded mutely, already unable to speak. "Emma, if you could choose, if it were completely up to you and nobody else's opinion mattered, where would you want to live? With your mother or with your father? And Emma, I'm going to give you a moment. I'm not going to ask you to use words because I can see that words are difficult for you right now. You can answer me however you need to." It was an impossible question, one designed to break a child in half, to choose one parent over the other, to betray one in order to stay with the other. Emma's hands began to shake. And then something shifted inside her. Emma looked down at her trembling hands. She took a breath, and she made the signal, the same circular motion with her fingers against her leg that she'd practiced hundreds of times with Karen, the trainer. It was subtle, barely noticeable to most of the people in the courtroom. A small gesture, a private conversation between a girl and her dog. But Max understood. The service dog rose smoothly from his designated area and moved directly toward the witness stand, ignoring the bailiff's surprised protest. The courtroom erupted in whispered confusion. This was unprecedented, a dog approaching the witness stand during active testimony. But Max didn't stop at the railing. He placed his front paws on the platform, his 85 pounds of golden fur suddenly there beside Emma, his head level with hers. The dog didn't seem confused or untrained. He moved with purpose, with absolute certainty about what he was doing and why he was doing it. Emma didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she wrapped her small arms around Max's neck and simply breathed. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, gradually slowed. Her trembling hands stilled. Within 30 seconds, a child who'd been in complete distress was calm. Within 30 seconds, a child who couldn't speak was communicating something profound without uttering a single word. Judge's face transformed. Her clinical expression shattered completely. For the first time, she wasn't looking at testimony or evidence or legal arguments. She was watching a child in genuine distress finding safety through an authentic connection with an animal trained specifically to help her. The entire courtroom was silent. Even the reporters seemed to hold their breath. No one wanted to break the spell of what was happening. After another moment, Emma whispered something to Max, inaudible to most of the courtroom but clear in its intent. She was saying goodbye. Not to her mother, not to her father, but to this moment, this terrible moment she'd been forced into. Max stepped down and returned to his designated area, the picture of training and obedience. Emma looked up, her eyes clearer than they'd been all week. "Your Honor," Emma said, her voice small but steady, "Max helps me when my words get stuck. He makes me feel safe." Judge set down her pen with deliberate care. She removed her reading glasses and set them on the desk in front of her. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Sarah began to wonder if something was wrong. The judge's hands trembled slightly as she folded them in front of her. When Judge finally spoke, her voice was different. All the clinical distance had evaporated, replaced by something more human. "That's enough," she said quietly. "Emma, you may step down." Emma climbed down from the stand, and this time when she looked at her mother, the shame was gone. She'd done it. She'd found a way to communicate what she needed to communicate. "I'm going to take a recess," Judge announced. 15 minutes. This court will reconvene at 10:00 a.m. As the judge stood and left the bench, Sarah saw something remarkable happening across her face. She'd been changed by what she'd witnessed. Not manipulated, not emotionally overwhelmed, but genuinely altered in her understanding of what had just occurred. David looked confused, looked furious, but neither of them seemed to understand what everyone else in the courtroom had just realized. They'd been shown the truth in its form, not through arguments or evidence or legal strategy, but through the unfiltered, undeniable reality of a therapeutic intervention working exactly as it was designed to work. Emma sat beside her mother, and Sarah held her daughter close. Max rested his head against Emma's knee. And in that moment, though the ruling hadn't officially been delivered, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind of hope that could be crushed by a judge's decision, but real hope. The kind born from witnessing something true and undeniable. The kind that comes from watching your child find her voice, even if that voice came in the form of a signal to a golden retriever. Judge, sitting alone in her chambers, looked at her written ruling. the ruling she'd been so certain about just 15 minutes ago. She picked up her pen and began to write something new. Not a summary of her previous conclusions, but a completely different opinion. An opinion shaped by what she just witnessed. An opinion that would become cited in legal journals and family law conferences across the country. Outside the courtroom, as the 15 minutes of recess unfolded, nobody knew yet that they were witnessing a landmark moment. Nobody knew that what had just happened would change how courts viewed service animals, how they understood therapeutic intervention, and how they listened to children who couldn't speak. All they knew was that they'd witnessed something true, something real, something that transcended every argument and every strategy. And sometimes, that's all justice really is, the moment when truth is finally allowed to speak for itself. Judge returned to the bench at exactly 10:00 a.m., and her demeanor had shifted noticeably. The clinical distance that had characterized her earlier in the trial had been replaced by something more engaged, more alert. She'd spent those 15 minutes in her chambers doing something she rarely did, questioning her own assumptions. "This court would like to call Dr. Santos," Judge announced without preamble. "Will Dr. Santos approach the stand?" Had been texting frantically during the recess, trying to reach Dr. Santos, who was waiting outside the courthouse in case she was needed. Within 5 minutes, the psychologist appeared in the courtroom, a woman in her early 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and the bearing of someone used to being taken seriously in professional settings. Dr. Santos was sworn in, and Judge began her questions with deliberate precision. "Dr. Santos, can you please explain to this court your professional qualifications and your experience with anxiety disorders in children?" Dr. Santos spoke clearly, accustomed to translating clinical concepts for non-medical audiences. She detailed her PhD in child psychology from the University of Washington, her 15 years of clinical practice, her specialization in anxiety disorders and trauma responses in pediatric patients, and her research published in peer-reviewed journals. "I've treated over 400 children with various anxiety presentations," Dr. Santos explained. "Approximately 37% of my caseload involves children with selective mutism or related anxiety-based communication disorders. I'm quite familiar with Emma's diagnosis." "And you're treating Emma currently?" Judge asked. "I am. I've been her primary therapist for approximately 8 months. I made the recommendation for a service dog approximately 6 months ago." Judge leaned forward slightly. "Why did you make that recommendation? Why did you feel that medication and traditional therapy were insufficient?" Dr. Santos took a breath, clearly preparing to explain something complex. "Your Honor, selective mutism is a fascinating and poorly understood condition. It's not a choice or a behavioral problem. It's an anxiety disorder rooted in neurobiology. When a child with selective mutism encounters a triggering situation, which for Emma includes any high-stress environment like a courtroom or sometimes even school, their amygdala, the fear center of the brain, becomes hyperactive. This triggers the fight-flight-freeze response. In Emma's case, it manifests as freezing, which includes the inability to produce speech." The judge was taking notes, her expression focused and intent. "The traditional treatment pathway involves cognitive behavioral therapy, which I implemented. We use gradual exposure, anxiety management techniques, sometimes medication. These approaches can be effective, but they require the child to essentially push through the anxiety. They require willpower and effort. For some children, especially for very young children like Emma, this creates a paradox. We're asking them to overcome anxiety by sitting with anxiety, and sometimes they become more anxious rather than less." "So traditional therapy wasn't working," Judge clarified. "Traditional therapy was providing some benefit, but we'd plateaued. Emma's school attendance had improved to about 60% with intensive support, but her communication remained severely limited. She was still experiencing daily panic symptoms. The medications we tried had mixed results and came with side effects. I believed she needed an additional intervention, something that would help regulate her nervous system before she could effectively engage with the anxiety work. Stood, Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the witness. Judge nodded. You may proceed. Approached with her predatory grace. Dr. Santos, isn't it true that service animals are being increasingly used as emotional support animals by people who don't actually need them? Isn't there a significant problem with service animal fraud in this country? There is, Dr. Santos acknowledged. However, there's an important distinction between legitimate service animals and pets misrepresented as service animals. Emma's dog, Max, is a legitimate service animal with professional training from a certified organization. His training is specific and evidence-based. But couldn't this dog simply be a distraction from the real work of therapy? Couldn't it be enabling Emma to avoid her anxiety rather than confronting it? This was the critical question, the argument that had shaped so much of David's case. Dr. Santos didn't hesitate. No, that's actually a common misconception. What Max does is provide what we call neurophysiological regulation. When Emma is in a state of severe anxiety, her nervous system is, her heart rate is elevated, her cortisol levels are elevated, her breathing is rapid. This state is incompatible with learning. Max helps bring her nervous system back to a regulated state where learning, including learning how to manage anxiety, can actually occur. Can you provide evidence for this claim? Asked skeptically. Absolutely. Dr. Santos pulled out a folder. I have objective data on Emma's functioning before and after the introduction of Max. Her school attendance increased from approximately 60% to 95%. Her sleep disturbances decreased by 85%. Her self-reported anxiety scores on the SCARED scale, that's the screen for child anxiety-related emotional disorders, decreased from a clinical level of 42 to a subclinical level of 14. Her teacher reports increased hand-raising and classroom participation. Her verbal interactions with peers have increased measurably. Judge was writing rapidly, but she'd also stopped with a raised hand. Dr. Santos, let me ask you something directly. In your professional opinion, is this service dog helping Emma, or is it a placeholder for real therapeutic work? Dr. Santos met the judge's eyes directly. In my professional opinion, the service dog is an essential component of Emma's therapeutic treatment plan. It's not a replacement for therapy. It's not a cure. It's a legitimate medical intervention with significant evidence supporting its efficacy. Without Max, I genuinely believe Emma's anxiety would continue to deteriorate. With Max, she's making genuine progress toward managing her disorder. And that's based on your 15 years of clinical experience and your training in neurobiology and anxiety disorders. Yes, Your Honor. That's based on my professional expertise, the clinical data, and peer-reviewed research. Tried a different approach. Dr. Santos, what happens if Emma loses access to this dog? What if her father is awarded custody and chooses not to continue this intervention? It was a trap, or so thought, but Dr. Santos had anticipated this. If Emma lost access to Max, I would expect her anxiety to escalate significantly. She would likely regress to her previous baseline or worse. The neural pathways that have been developed with Max's support would begin to deteriorate. Essentially, we'd lose 18 months of therapeutic progress. So Emma would become dependent on this dog. Emma has become appropriately reliant on a therapeutic tool. Just as a diabetic child becomes appropriately reliant on insulin, Emma has become appropriately reliant on a service animal that's helping her manage a neurological disorder. That's not a sign of weakness or failure. That's a sign of successful treatment. Judge asked one more question. Dr. Santos, what did you observe when Emma was on the witness stand earlier this week? And what did you observe just now when she recalled to testify? Dr. Santos glanced at Emma, who was sitting with Max's head in her lap. What I observed on Tuesday was a child in acute anxiety, unable to access her verbal faculties due to neurological shutdown. What I observed just now was the same child, with Max's support, able to achieve nervous system regulation sufficient to communicate, even if that communication was nonverbal. That's the service dog doing exactly what it's trained to do, helping a child access the emotional regulation necessary to function. Judge set down her pen. Thank you, Dr. Santos. That's very illuminating. As Dr. Santos was excused, there was a palpable shift in the courtroom's energy. The judge had heard what she needed to hear. She'd witnessed the reality of Emma's anxiety and the effectiveness of the intervention. Now she'd heard the scientific explanation that validated what she'd seen. Tried to recover. She called her own expert witness, a psychologist from David's team who argued that service animals were overused and that traditional approaches were more effective. But his testimony fell flat. Judge barely took notes. She'd already made up her mind about the validity of the science. By the time the expert testimony concluded, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom. The judge wasn't just entertaining evidence anymore. She was understanding, at a visceral and intellectual level, exactly why Max mattered and why Emma needed her mother, the person who had fought for this intervention when everyone else had doubted it. Sarah watched Judge as she prepared to issue her final ruling. The judge's face was thoughtful, resolved. She'd come into this trial certain of one thing. She was leaving it certain of something completely different. And that transformation, born from a moment of authentic connection and reinforced by scientific evidence, was about to change the trajectory of Emma's life forever. Judge took only 45 minutes to issue her written ruling. 45 minutes to dismantle 32 years of legal philosophy and write something that would become cited in family law journals across the country. The courtroom had filled again. Word had spread that the judge was about to issue her decision, and the media presence had intensified. Cameras waited outside. Reporters checked their phones, anticipating a story. At 11:15 a.m., Judge returned to the bench. She looked different somehow, less armored, more human. She held her written decision in her hands, and there was a slight tremor in those hands as she began to read. In the matter of V, she began, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. This court has carefully considered all evidence, testimony, and expert opinion presented during these proceedings. What I am about to issue is not merely a custody decision. It is an acknowledgement of what I witnessed in this courtroom, and what the science behind those observations reveals about the nature of therapeutic intervention and healing. Sarah felt grip her arm. David sat motionless, his face already showing signs of anxiety. The petitioner, David, presents himself as a stable, concerned father. He has demonstrated financial stability and a genuine concern for his daughters. However, stability of income does not equate to understanding of a child's therapeutic needs. Structure is important, but not at the expense of evidence-based treatment. Judge adjusted her reading glasses and continued. The respondent, Sarah, has demonstrated remarkable dedication to her daughter's care. More importantly, she has demonstrated the wisdom to seek innovative, evidence-based interventions when traditional approaches reached a plateau. She has sacrificed her professional opportunities, her time, and her emotional resources to ensure that her daughter receives optimal care. This is not the behavior of an unstable mother. This is the behavior of a parent who understands that love sometimes means being willing to be unconventional. Sarah felt tears beginning to form behind her eyes. During these proceedings, I witnessed something that fundamentally altered my understanding of how children heal. I witnessed a child in acute distress, a child whose anxiety had stolen her voice, find safety through connection with a specially trained service animal. This was not a performance. This was not manipulation. This was a therapeutic intervention working exactly as it is designed to work. The judge set down her written decision for a moment, and looked directly at Emma. "Emma, you are a remarkably brave young woman. You came to this courtroom and tried to speak for yourself, even though speaking is hard for you. That took courage. And when words failed you, you found another way to communicate your truth. That also took courage." Emma's hand tightened on Sarah's as tears rolled down her small face. "Now, as to the custody determination," Judge continued, picking up her decision again. "This court finds that it is in the best interests of the minor child that primary custody be granted to the respondent, Sarah, with visitation rights granted to the petitioner, David, on alternating weekends and 1 week during summer vacation." Stood abruptly. "Your Honor, I would like to request—" "You will sit down," Judge said, her voice carrying an edge of steel. "I am not finished." "Sad. However," the judge continued, "this custody arrangement comes with specific conditions that are critical to the minor's ongoing. The first condition is that Emma shall remain in therapy with Dr. Santos or another qualified child psychologist specializing in anxiety disorders. This is non-negotiable." Judge turned a page in her decision. "The second condition is that Emma shall maintain her relationship with and access to her service dog, Max. This is not optional. This dog is a critical component of the minor's therapeutic treatment plan. Any disruption to this relationship would constitute a material change in circumstances that could warrant custody modification." David's attorney whispered something urgently to him, but he seemed to be in shock. "I have given significant thought to the legal precedent for this decision," Judge explained. "Service animals have traditionally been viewed as medical devices, tools for physical accessibility. However, the evidence presented in this case, combined with my own observations, demonstrates that service animals for psychiatric and anxiety-related conditions are equally legitimate medical interventions. I am therefore treating Max not as a pet, but as a medical necessity." The judge continued, "Emma's access to her service dog is as essential as a diabetic child's access to insulin. To separate them would be to deliberately damage the therapeutic progress that has been achieved. No court should do this." Judge made eye contact with David directly. "The petitioner is welcome to maintain a relationship with his daughter. However, that relationship must be conducted in acknowledgement of what actually helps this child. Emma needs her mother. Emma needs Dr. Santos. And Emma needs Max. These 3 elements create a therapeutic system that is working. To disrupt any element of this system would be to disrupt the minor's recovery." She turned her attention back to her written decision. "This court also notes that the introduction of the service animal in this case has coincided with measurable improvements in the minor's functioning, increased school attendance, improved sleep quality, enhanced social interaction, and beginning recovery of her voice. These are not coincidental improvements. These are the direct result of evidence-based therapeutic intervention." Judge's voice became more formal as she read the final paragraphs of her ruling. "In conclusion, this court finds that Sarah is the appropriate custodial parent for Emma. This court further finds that the service dog known as Max is an essential element of the minor's therapeutic care. This court also makes note of the remarkable resilience demonstrated by Emma in these proceedings, and the extraordinary courage it required for her to communicate her needs in the absence of words." She set down her decision. "The petitioner is welcome to request modifications to this arrangement if there are material changes in circumstances. However, I want to be abundantly clear on the record. Any attempt to separate this child from her service dog without compelling medical or safety reasons will be viewed as an attempt to interfere with the minor's ongoing medical treatment, and this court will not look favorably upon such actions. Is that understood?" She looked directly at David. David nodded mutely. His attorney looked absolutely stunned. His face had gone pale. Judge banged her gavel once. "This court is adjourned." For a moment there was absolute silence in the courtroom. Then Sarah made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob, a release of months of tension and fear. She pulled Emma close and felt her daughter's small body shake with sobs of relief. Stood and shook her hand, and even he seemed moved by the magnitude of the decision. "You won," he said quietly. "You actually won, and you won decisively. That ruling is airtight." David stood and left the courtroom quickly, his attorney trailing behind him, already on her phone making calls. Judge had not just ruled in favor of Sarah, she had fundamentally validated every choice Sarah had made, every unconventional path she'd chosen, every moment she'd fought for her daughter. As Sarah and Emma made their way out of the courtroom, reporters surrounded them, shouting questions. But Sarah kept Emma close and said nothing. There would be time for statements later. Right now, all that mattered was that her daughter was safe. All that mattered was that the judge had understood. All that mattered was that love, combined with courage and science and the unwavering loyalty of a golden retriever, had triumphed over skepticism and legal maneuvering. In her chambers, Judge sat alone and read through her decision one more time. She'd spent 32 years on the bench, 32 years developing a hard shell, assuming the worst about human nature. But in the past 6 hours, she'd been reminded that sometimes, rarely but powerfully, people, and children, do extraordinary things that transcend every cynical assumption. She thought about the moment Emma had made that subtle signal to Max. She thought about how in a single gesture, a child had communicated more truth than all the testimony and legal arguments combined could convey. She thought about how sometimes, real justice isn't about following precedent. It's about recognizing truth when you see it, even if that truth comes in a form you've never encountered before. Judge picked up her phone and called the family law conference coordinator. She'd been asked to speak at a conference in 2 months. She'd declined. Now she accepted. "I have something I need to tell people," she said simply. "Something about service animals, about children with anxiety, and about what it looks like when justice finally sees clearly." Outside the courthouse, Emma walked between her mother and her dog, holding both their hands. She was tired, emotionally exhausted, but safe. Deeply, completely safe. The ruling was final. The victory was absolute. And the service dog had become, in the eyes of the law, a recognized medical necessity, a precedent that would help countless other children and their service animals for years to come. 6 months after Judge's ruling, Emma sat at her kitchen table completing her 3rd grade homework with a focus and clarity that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. She was working on a math assignment, multiplying 2-digit numbers, and Max's head rested gently on her lap, his warm weight providing the grounding presence that had become as natural as breathing. The house was quiet except for the sound of pencil on paper and the occasional creak of the old Portland craftsman home settling. Sarah stood in the doorway watching her daughter, and the gratitude that flooded through her nearly overwhelmed her. This moment, this ordinary, beautiful moment of her daughter simply being well, felt like a miracle. Emma wore her school hoodie and had her hair in the messy bun she insisted on styling herself. Her face was peaceful. She was healthy. She was home. "How's the math coming?" Sarah asked, stepping into the kitchen to pour herself a cup of coffee. "I got 14 right out of 15, Emma announced, not looking up from her worksheet. "I made a mistake on number 8, but I fixed it." A year ago, Emma wouldn't have volunteered information about her homework. A year ago, she would have been silent, anxious, her voice locked away behind walls of fear. Now she was chatty, confident in her own competence, willing to acknowledge her mistakes without shame. "That's excellent, baby," Sarah said, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "You're doing so well." Emma looked up at her mother and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "I really am, aren't I? Dr. Santos said I'm a success story now." This was true. Emma's progress had become the subject of professional discussion. Dr. Santos had presented Emma's case at a child psychology conference, discussing the effectiveness of service animals in treating selective mutism. The presentation had received significant attention, generating interest from other therapists and researchers. Emma's journey, from completely nonverbal and anxiety-inducing situations to being able to participate in class discussions and engage in social interactions, had become a model for how integrated therapeutic approaches could work. School had become a completely different experience for Emma. She participated in class, raised her hand to answer questions, and had made several genuine friendships. Her second-grade teacher had noted the transformation, and her current third-grade teacher reported that Emma was one of the most engaged students in the classroom. The school had even featured Emma and Max in their newsletter as an example of how they supported students with different learning and emotional needs. Max's presence had sparked conversations at the school about service animals and therapeutic support. The principal had worked with Corinne, Max's trainer, to develop guidelines for service dog access in school settings. Other families had begun inquiring about whether service animals might help their children. Emma had inadvertently become an advocate for something she'd never set out to advocate for, simply by being herself, by thriving, by becoming living proof of what was possible. The visitation schedule with David had settled into a manageable rhythm. He had Emma every other weekend and was struggling with the reality of his daughter's profound connection to her mother and her dog. He tried initially to create tension around the service dog, suggesting that Emma was becoming too dependent on Max, but Emma had simply explained, with the bluntness of a 7-year-old stating obvious facts, that Max helped her feel safe, and she needed Max with her. David had eventually accepted the reality of the situation. He would never fully understand the depth of Emma's selective mutism or the legitimacy of the service dog intervention, but he'd come to recognize that his daughter was thriving and that arguing against that reality served no purpose. Their relationship had shifted from hostile to cordial, and Emma seemed to handle the transitions between homes with increasing ease. Sarah had returned to full-time nursing at the hospital, but with a flexible schedule that allowed her to prioritize Emma's needs. She'd been promoted to a position in cardiac care management, a role that gave her more control over her hours. The financial pressure that had haunted her during the custody battle had eased considerably. She could breathe again. Judge's ruling had become exactly what she'd written it would become, a precedent-setting decision. 3 months after the ruling, the Oregon Family Law Bar Association had published an article discussing the implications of recognizing service animals as medical necessities in custody determinations. The article cited Judge's decision extensively and discussed how it might apply to other cases. Judge had indeed spoken at the Family Law Conference, and her presentation had been standing room only. She described her journey from skepticism to understanding, the moment in the courtroom when Emma signaled to Max, and how that single gesture had taught her more about justice and healing than 32 years on the bench. The presentation had been recorded and had circulated through legal education channels. Judge had become, unexpectedly, an advocate for the role of service animals in family law. 4 months after the ruling, a family from Seattle had contacted Sarah's lawyer asking if they could reference Judge's decision in their own custody case involving a service dog for a child with PTSD. The case had resulted in a favorable ruling for the mother. Then another case in California cited the decision. The ruling was becoming part of legal precedent, slowly changing how courts viewed service animals and therapeutic intervention. Emma's transformation extended beyond school and home. She joined a youth soccer league, something that would have been impossible a year earlier due to her anxiety. She was terrible at soccer. She kicked the ball in random directions and seemed more interested in chasing butterflies than following the play. But she was there, participating, present. She was experiencing childhood in a way that seemed to have been stolen from her. One evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, her daughter asked a question that revealed just how much she understood about her own journey. "Mom, why did I get sick?" Emma asked, lying under her lavender duvet with Max curled up on the foot of her bed. Sarah sat on the edge of the mattress. Your brain was dealing with a lot of big, scary feelings after Daddy and I separated. Sometimes when we're scared or stressed, our brains protect us in ways that aren't always helpful. Your brain tried to protect you by making it hard to speak when you felt scared. But Max helped me get better, Emma said. Max did help you get better, and Dr. Santos helped, and I helped. But most importantly, you helped yourself. You were so brave, baby. You kept trying even when things were hard. Emma was quiet for a moment. I'm glad I have Max, and I'm glad I have you. Sarah leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead. I'm glad I have you too. You're my favorite person in the whole world. After Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah sat in the living room with a glass of wine and her laptop, scrolling through the various articles and case references that had cited Judge's ruling. She found herself on the Pacific Northwest Service Animals website, where they'd added a section specifically about Emma's case with appropriate privacy protections. The organization was reporting increased inquiries from families interested in service dogs for anxiety disorders, specifically citing Emma's story as an example of what was possible. Sarah felt a profound sense of peace that had been absent for so long. The custody battle had been devastating, but it had also led to something beautiful, not just the preservation of her relationship with Emma, but a transformation in how the legal system thought about therapeutic interventions and children's needs. A year and a half ago, she'd been terrified. She'd been fighting for her daughter's life, convinced that losing custody would destroy them both. The anxiety had been all-consuming, the fear paralyzing. But they'd survived. More than survived, they'd thrived. Emma had found her voice again, not through force but through connection. The legal system had, against all odds, recognized the legitimacy of that connection. And the ripples of that moment, Emma's subtle signal to Max in the courtroom, continued to spread, helping other children, changing how other families were treated by the courts. Judge had called Sarah a few weeks after the conference. It was an unusual contact, blending the personal and professional in ways that weren't strictly appropriate. But the judge had felt compelled. I wanted you to know, Judge said, that I've thought about that moment in the courtroom more times than I can count. That moment changed me professionally and personally. I realized that I'd spent 32 years assuming the worst about people and situations. But your daughter taught me that sometimes people do extraordinary things. Sometimes children are braver than adults. Sometimes love finds a way that transcends every legal strategy and every cynical assumption. Sarah had been moved to tears by the call. Now, sitting in her living room with the spring rain pattering against the windows, Sarah looked at her daughter's artwork displayed on the refrigerator. Emma's drawings had become more elaborate over the months, pictures of her with Max, with her mother, with her teacher, with her friends at soccer. The drawings were titled things like Me and Max at School and My Family Now, and When I Feel Sad, Max Helps Me Be Happy Again. These drawings were the testimony that mattered most, not the court documents or the legal precedents or the articles in professional journals. These drawings, created by a child who'd found her way from silence to self-expression, were the true measure of justice. Emma would grow up knowing that she'd changed something. She'd changed a judge's mind. She'd changed the legal system's understanding of therapeutic intervention. She'd changed how other children with service dogs were treated. And she'd done it simply by being authentic, by allowing her dog to help her, by finding her voice in the most unexpected way. At 7 years old, Emma had become an accidental advocate for change. And that change had rippled outward in ways that would help countless other children for years to come. In the end, that was the real victory, not the custody ruling, though that mattered. The real victory was a child who'd learned to speak again, a mother who'd learned to trust herself, and a legal system that had learned to recognize that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes in the form of a child's quiet signal to her faithful companion.